Hey, what's up subscribers and watchers, welcome back to another series of Android Advanced Tutorial. This is your tutor Zaid here from Computer Science for Self-Taught. And in this series I'm gonna show you how you can set multiple permissions in your app and ask the user to grant those permissions, to grant all those permissions at the same time. So you must declare all of your permissions inside the manifest file by using the tag uses permissions and provide the name of the permissions. Only declare permissions that your app needs by listing them in the manifest file. And also remember that requesting the user to approve each permission at runtime. If your user is installing your app on Android 6.0 or higher, so those permissions will be asked at the user at the runtime. If the user installing your app on lower versions of Android, lower than 6.0 or on Lollipop, so those permissions will be asked at the time of installation from the user. So we will categorize these permissions into two types. One is normal permissions and another is dangerous permissions. As you can see, this is a dialog of permissions that will be asked from the user at runtime. If that user is installing your app on Android 6.0 or higher, then the user will get this type of dialog to provide the permission. If your user is installing your Android on lower versions, less than 6.0 on Lollipop, all of the permissions will be asked at the time of installation. So as I've told you, there are two types of permissions, normal permissions and dangerous permissions. Let's discover what are these normal and dangerous permissions in detail. The first one is normal permissions. These normal permissions are granted immediately upon installation. If your user is installing your app on Android Marshmallow 6.0 or higher, or lower than 6.0 Android version. So the normal permissions will not be asked at the runtime, so they will be immediately granted by the system upon the installation. So as you can see, these are all the normal permissions that will be provided automatically by your system. So let's discover what is the dangerous permission. So another type of permission is dangerous permission, and the user must explicitly grant those dangerous permissions at runtime in Android Marshmallow 6.0 or higher than Marshmallow. So these are all the type of dangerous permissions that the user will be asked at the time of installation or at runtime, because they will access the user's privacy. So that's why it's called dangerous permission. And if you want to know more about dangerous permissions and normal permissions, make sure that you check out the developer.com and read all the context and stuff about types of permissions. So let's jump to Android Studio and let's discover how we can provide these permissions upon installation or upon runtime from the user. If you see, I've already created two buttons. One is the name of provide permissions, and the ID of this button is button provide permission. Whenever the user click on this button, so it's gonna ask the user to provide those permissions. If those permissions are already granted, so a pop-up message will appear and tell the user that all the permissions granted, so you don't need to worry and you need to start your work. Whenever the user click on the check permission, which is this button, and it has an ID as the name of BTN check permission, so it's going to the application activity, where you will see all the characteristics of this applications, like whether this application has granted all the permissions for this user or where it stores all of its data and many more. So I've already handled the on click of these two buttons, like one is permission checker method and another one is permission provider. So these methods are already provided inside the main activity, which are these permission checker and permission provider. Before I go further, make sure that you provide those permissions that your app needs. You need to provide them inside the manifest. Inside the main activity, you're going to call these permissions from the manifest and ask the user to provide these permissions for you. And in here, two permissions are normal permissions, as I've told you before. One is internet and another one is access Wi-Fi state. The system will automatically grant these permissions upon installation or runtime. As you will see, these two permissions will not be asked at runtime from the user, but these external storage, camera, write, calendar and access location will be asked from the user to provide these dangerous permissions. Okay, so let's go to main activity and let's see how we can ask multiple permissions at the same time from the user. So the first thing is, whenever the user click on provide permissions, so the system going to check if those permissions are already granted or not. How we can check if the permissions are already granted or not? First, we will use if statements in here. So we use the context compact class context compact, and we call the check self permission. So the first parameter we need to pass the context. As you know that all activities are subclass of context. We need to pass this as context, which refers to our main activity, and in here we need to provide the permissions that we have written inside manifest. So I've already written in here, so I do not need to do a lot of switching between manifest and main activity. So I've already listed all these permissions. So how can I do that? So in here you need to provide the internet permissions, like you can use manifest. Make sure that you use the provide version. One is java.util and another one is Android. Make sure that you use this permission. Click on it and call the permission.intern. Okay, so let me just put them here and also here. So let's make some space and let's provide its body and also provide if else statement. So if the permission is granted, so it's going to return 0. If the permission is not granted, so it's going to return 1. And we use the plus in here, and again we use context compact dot check self permission. We need to pass context, and we use manifest dot permission dot read external storage plus context compact dot check self permission. We need to pass the context manifest dot permission dot camera plus context compact dot check self permission, pass the context manifest dot permission dot write calendar plus context compact dot check self permission this manifest dot permission dot find location access find location plus context compact dot check self permission pass this manifest dot permission dot Wi-Fi state. So in here we are going to say if those permissions are not granted, so we use the package manager dot permission granted. If we look in here, you can see if the permission is granted, so the check self permission will return 0, and if the permission is not granted or the permission is denied, so it's going to return -1. So in here you might think why I use plus in here. So if the permission of internet is granted, so it's returned 0. So we use the plus to sum of the returned value from context check self permission to context check self permission of storage. If these evaluations are calculated as 0, it means that the permission is granted, because in here the permission granted is 0. If this part is evaluated at 0, so it means that the permission is granted, so we have evaluated by using this one. And here I said if the permission was not granted, so come and do this part of code. So if the permission was granted, so you can do the rest of the work. Imagine that if the user has granted the permission of internet and read external storage, but the remaining permissions are not granted, so if one of them returns -1, the whole expression is evaluated as -1. So in that case, -1 is not equals to 0. So it means that the permissions are not granted. If the permission is granted, we do some work in here. So in here you can write the code or the task that you want to do something. Like I can toast a message in here. Hooray, all permissions are granted. If the permission is not granted, so it comes inside the if statement. So in here again we use if. If the permission is not granted, so request the user to grant them all. Let's provide the else part in here. So in here we use if. So in here I use the activity compact dot should show request permission rational. What does should show request permission rational returns? It returns true or false if it is the first time that these permissions are asked from the user. If it is the first time, so it will return false and the else part will be executed. If the user has installed the application for the first time and these permissions are not granted, so it comes inside the if statement, and here it checks should request permission rational. It checks if it is the first time. If it is the first time, it returns false, so it comes inside the else. It is the first time, so now we ask the user to provide those permissions. So how we can do that? We use the activity compact dot request permission. So in here you need to pass the context, and in here you need to provide those permissions. You need to provide those permissions inside the string, and also provide a request code, because later on we will check if those requests are the requests that we have sent to the Android system or not. So we use private static final end. So in here I said permission code, and you must write 19. You can also put any values instead of 90. So I'm going to put that request permission in here. permission code. Inside this string, we need to provide all of those permissions: internet permissions, external storage permissions, and camera permissions. So in here again, I use the manifest.permission.internet, manifest.permission.read external storage, and make sure that you separate them by comma, manifest.permission.camera, manifest.permission.calendar, write calendar, manifest.permission.find access find location, manifest.permission.wi-fi state. 6 permissions that will be asked from the user at the same time. In here, we are going to override another method to check if that is the permission that we have sent to the Android system or not. So make sure that you import the onRequest on permission result. Make sure that you clean this one and come down in here. So in here, this is a method that you will check if that is the permission that you have sent to the Android system or not. So in here, you're going to check by using the request method, and in here you say that if the request code was equals to the permission code, the request that we have sent to the Android system or not. So in here, if it is the request that we have asked the Android system, so it's evaluated to true and it comes inside the body of if statement. So again in here we check array that holds our permissions, I mean permission that is granted and all those permissions. So in here I say if the grant results.length was greater than 0, it means that there is some permissions which have been evaluated to true. Make sure that you provide its body and also its else. If the length was greater than 0, and so I'm going to put something in here, and if the grant results of index 0, if the permission is granted, so it returns 0, sum it with grant results index 1 plus grant results index 2, grant results index 3, grant results index 4, grant results index 5. Let's check if this is 5 permission or 6 permission. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, 6 permissions, and the index of this one is 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So we need to use 5 0 boxes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Okay, so if the sum was equals to the package manager.permission granted. Okay, if these are summed as 0, so it's going to be equal to 0. It means the permission is granted. As you know that this attribute, which is a static, has the value of 0. As you can see, public static final and permission granted 0. So it holds the 0 version. If any of these become -1, so it's going to be evaluated as -1. So if it is checked as -1 equals to 0, so it means the permission is not granted. If any of them return 0, if any of these boxes holds the value of -1, all of them will be evaluated as -1. So if the permission is granted, come inside and do the work. Otherwise, tell the user that the permissions denied. If the permission is granted, so we post a message to the user, all permissions are granted. So you can write a code or the task that you want to do after the user grants all the permissions to your app. So make sure that you write the codes that you want to be executed after those permissions. Otherwise, if the permissions are not granted, make sure that you toss a message, permissions are not denied. So let's minimize this one. So in here, if it is the second time the user clicks on the button, so we will check that. So in here I say, so we need to pass the context and also the permissions, manifest.permission dot, so which permission that we want to request, internet permissions, and we use in here or. So let me enter this one so that we can see it very clearly. Or activity compact dot show request permission rational this manifest.permission dot read external storage, or activity compact dot show request permission rational this manifest.permission dot cam, or activity compact dot show request permission rational manifest dot permission dot write calendar, or we can say calendar here, or activity compact dot show request permission rational manifest dot permission dot find access find location, or activity compact dot show request permission rational this manifest dot permission dot Wi-Fi state. Okay, the should request permission rational returns either true or false. If it is the first time the user opens your app and click on grant permission, so the should request permission will return false. So this is what we expect. If it is the first time, So these permissions, all of them will be evaluated as false. So the else part will be executed, where we will ask the user to provide these permissions. Or if the user clicks on the provide button for the second time, so this should request permission additional will return true. So if it is true, so the body inside of this if statement will be executed, and in here we will give more explanations about these permissions by using a dialog. So we will provide some information inside the dialog and tell the user, if you provide these permissions, these functionalities will be used by this app, and you can use all the functionalities. So as you know that you might think, why I use or statement in here? I mean, as you know that if one of these expressions evaluated to true, the remaining permissions will be calculated as true. For example, if it is the second time and the user didn't provide the internet permissions, so it will return true. So if this part of or statement evaluates to true, the remaining these expressions will be evaluated as true. If this expression evaluates to false, so this part of or statement will be executed till the end until one of them returns true. So if it is the second time and the user hasn't provided any of those permissions, so we will tell the user to provide those permissions by using a dialog. So we use the alert dialog and we use the builder. So we create a builder equals to new alert dialog.builder, and we pass the context for this parameter. And again, we set the title. So we say permissions require, and we need to set our message. Tell why we need these permissions, why you need to provide these permissions. So we say, if you want to use all the functionalities of this app, so let me copy and paste that, internet and access Wi-Fi. Now we need to set a positive and negative button. I mean cancel and OK or grant permissions. We use the set positive button, and in here we say grant all permissions, and in here we need to handle its on-click, new on-click listener. In here we will again do the same thing. So I'm gonna copy this and paste in here. You can also use a method and provide this code inside that method and call only that method in here. And here it gives us error, so we need to pass main activity dot this to this one, because we are inside an inner class, okay, an anonymous inner class. Again, we need to set the cancel button, so the user doesn't want to provide this permission. Negative buttons, so you can also new listener, so you can dismiss the dial. And we also set the set cancelable to false. And again, we need to pass dialog builder dot yet, and we use d dot show. Okay, so let's check out if so nothing is left in here. These methods are all for the provide permissions. Here we need to write some codes for checking the permissions. So if the user didn't give those permissions, or user has provided some permissions but not all of them, how does he know which permissions he hasn't provided? Whenever the user click on the check permissions, so comes inside the permission checker, we use intents to open the application's settings activity. We use intent equals to new intent. Make sure that you provide the action type data for this intent. You can also provide inside the constructor, and you can also use the intent object and set the action. So we use the settings dot application action application detail settings. Okay. Open the activity of settings of this app. Now you need to provide its data. So its data is in the form of URI equals to. So in here you must use URI from parts. So the first scheme is package. We need to pass the package, and the second parameter you need to pass the package name. So you can also use main activity dot this dot get package name, which returns a string, and the third parameter for fragment use al. Now you need to use intent, and you need to pass its data, pass URI. So now you need to open that activity, start activity, and pass the intent in here. You need to provide three things for an intent: its action, its data. The click happens. So I'm going to click run and click OK. Again, if I click on the provide permission, so this method will be executed. So in here I ask that the permissions check if the permissions are already granted or not. So as you can see, if it is the first time the user opens the app and click on this provide permission, so none of those permissions are granted. This part of if statement will be evaluated false, which means these expressions will return -1. So -1 is not equals to 0. So it comes inside the if statement, I mean the inner if. Here it checks if it is the first time user will be asked to provide the permissions or not. So if it is the first time, all of these expressions will return false. This is what we want, because the should request permission rational either returns true or false. If it is the first time, so it returns false. If it is the second time, it will return true, and this part will be executed. Now it is the first time, so the else part will be executed, and it will ask the user to provide these 6 permissions. As you can see, there are 6 permissions, and among these 6 permissions, 2 of them are normal permissions, internet and Wi-Fi state. These permissions will not be asked because these are normal permissions. They are already granted by the system. Now, if I click the provide permissions, the dialog will appear and ask the user to provide these permissions. And there you go. As you can see in here, 1 of 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. So these 4 permissions are dangerous permissions. So the internet and access Wi-Fi set are not among these dangerous permissions. So the internet and Wi-Fi set are already granted. Here it says that allow multi-permission, I mean this app access your media file storage on your device. You can see the sequence you write these permissions will be asked from the user inside your app. It didn't ask the internet for the first time, so because it is normal, ask the user to provide storage. As you can see, photos, media, and file to your device. If you click deny, so the camera permission will be asked. Allow permission to take pictures and record. If I click deny, the calendar permission will be appear, as you can see. And if I click deny, the location, the GPS location will be appear, and you can see it is end of the permissions, and the Wi-Fi state is normal, so it's already granted. So if I click deny, it says permissions denied. So the request permission result will be executed. Length is -1. This part will be evaluated to false. So it says the permissions denied. So in here, if I click on the provide permission, now it is the second time system asks the user to provide the permissions. So in here, if the permission provider will be checked, none of those permissions are granted. So it comes inside the inner if. So in here, the should show request permission rational this time will return true because it is the second time that the user will be asked to provide the permissions. If it is the second time, so a dialog should be appear and tell the user what exactly your app needs. So you will say this message, and if the user click on the positive button, again those permissions will be asked, and the sequence you write in here. If you click no thanks, the dialog will be disappear. But the second time you can see, bam. You can see this is what you have written inside the inner if, and the should request permission returns true because it is the second time. It says permissions required. If you want to use all the functionalities of this app, make sure you provide these permissions: internet, read, external, blah 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 blah. So if I click no thanks, the dialog disappeared. Again, if I click the provide permissions, it is the third time that the system will ask the user to provide the permissions. So in here again, it returns true as well. You can see if I click the grant all permissions, so this positive button will be executed, and these permissions will be asked from the user. As you can see, allow permission to access media, click allow, and bam, there you go. Permissions are granted. So here the length is greater than 0, which is there are 5 permissions or 5 value. All of these permissions are evaluated 0, and the result of these summations will be evaluated to 0. So 0 is equals to 0, so it says all permissions are granted. If I click again, you can see, hooray, all permissions are granted. So again, if I click on the check permission, method will be executed, and it opens the activity settings of this application. You can see if you click on the permissions, you see these permissions are granted. Check the camera. If I turn back again, if I click the provide permission, should request permission will be executed because you didn't provide any of that permission. If I click on that, you see it only asks the pictures permission to provide. If you click deny, so now you see permission denied only for that permission. I mean, this app cannot use the camera permission. So how the user knows that? Whenever the user click on this button and comes to permission part, you see camera permission is not granted. If I click on the provide permission and click grant all permission and click allow, you see all permissions are granted. And if I click on check permission, you can see it is checked. So this brings us to the end of this particular tutorial, and thank you guys for watching. And in the next video we will learn about JSON parsing or how we can parse JSON by using Android. Be sure to stay tuned for the next episode because we are going to get into more stuff. And if you're new to this channel, make sure that you subscribe it. And thank you. I'll see you then.